Welcome to another Ape Reality podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, the creator of Noble Ape, and this evening I'd like to talk a little bit about the biology of Noble Ape, how it came to evolve, or in this case devolve, and what the future of the biology of Noble Ape holds. When I started developing Noble Ape in 1996, I had a vision of a very rich and detailed ecosystem, and if you look back at the original manuals, there are 12 animal species and 14 plant species in existence. I'll just read from the original manuals now to give the animals and plants specifically. In the animal species, there are noble apes, fierce felines, herbivorous mice, insectivorous mice, seabirds, night birds, seed-eating birds, insectivorous birds, ants, spiders, flies, and sea fish. And the plants, there is grass A and grass B, berry bush, bean bush, potato plant, fruit bush, flowering bush A, flowering bush B, berry tree, nut tree, nondescriptive tree A, nondescriptive tree B, nondescriptive tree C, and boatwood tree. The reason for the number of plants and animals that existed in the original simulation was I found through trial and error that through traditional predator-prey simulations where you have nonlinear equations contributing to the predators eating the prey and things of this nature, it was a lot easier to create a normalized ecosystem with a lot more plants and animals, and the interrelationship between the plants and the animals produced a beautiful cyclic ecosystem which went on to become what is now called Noble Ecology and what was called EcoSim at the time, which was a high school application where basically you had sliders to govern the initial populations of the plants and animals and their various eating characteristics, for want of a better term. And it was quite easy to generate quite beautiful, cyclical, stable ecosystems with more plants and animals, and that was the original background. The interesting juxtaposition in terms of the cognitive simulation initially was that of the noble ape on one side and the fierce feline on the other. The noble ape as the kind of quiet, reflective, thinking man's monkey, and on the other side the fierce feline, which was the classic kind of predatorial creature. Background to this, which comes out in the original manuals, was my early teens interest in Arnold Schwarzenegger films, in particular The Predator and The Terminator, and these ideas of Predator logic and Terminator logic in those two films. Interesting that such films affected me so strongly. Also, in the early period of Noble Ape, I went back and watched a lot of Vietnam War movies, or movies based on the Vietnam period, in order to get a sense of jungle and suspense and how that would translate to something like Noble Ape. This, in part, created the some background. The documentation that exists today with regards to Noble Ape is in fact a poor subset of the original documentation. Whilst I have continued to maintain the original manuals, which are now in paperback form, and what is called Noble Ape Philosophic, what was originally called Nirvana Philosophic, there was originally a biological, equivalent Nirvana Biologic and equivalent Nirvana Mathematica, and they all had interrelated calculations to do with how visualization, how sense data, how all this kind of information was actually going to map back into the simulation. So the simulation, as you see today, is in fact quite a poor subset of all this previous work, and most of that documentation is lost to time. I do have some backups of it, but the time involved in actually bringing it to a form where it could be online is far greater than currently available. I'd much rather get the simulation working on Mac OS X 4 currently. So, some background to this, there's a lot of additional documentation which isn't really mapped into things like the manuals or the philosophic document. And these documents were written typically between the manuals and Noble Ape Philosophic, or perhaps slightly after Noble Ape Philosophic. And they covered issues like how the Noble Apes hear and see, and how that is simulated mapped back. The original manuals describe a beautiful kind of 3D stereo meshing, which unfortunately is just too complicated and was very heavily simplified in, I think, what I called Nirvana Mathematic, which may be worth my time just digging up and putting online, although I suspect it's in an unfinished form. So from that environment, the Noble Apes existed in their little ecosystem and were constantly preyed upon by these fierce feline creatures that had nothing in the food chain that would eat them. However, the Noble Apes, in theory, would be able to trap them or at least dissuade them from attacking. And this was a very powerful initial model in the simulation, that the Noble Apes were constantly living in fear, and so to speak. This is the fear component of fear and desire. And this filtered back very heavily into their identity to have this kind of predatorial cat. By probably after Isle of the Apes, after the first CD-ROM was launched, the fierce felines were removed from the simulation. The Isle of the Apes CD did contain some information about the fierce felines and how they interacted with the Noble Apes, and how this was being simulated or would be simulated. There were initial demonstrations of fierce feline-ape interaction, but the whole thing became too convoluted, and ultimately in the kind of reductionist development of Noble Ape that went through to about 98 and then was restarted in 2000, the fierce felines have kind of dropped away. What also is interesting is that the plants and animal classifications from the list that I originally read out were greatly simplified and greatly reduced, in part because there was a drop-down menu setting that enabled you to watch the population growth and development of all these different species, and to have 12 animals and 14 plant types. Well, let's eliminate the fierce felines and Noble Apes as they're as autonomous animals. So 12 and 12, 24 different species types at a drop-down was quite user-confusing. An important point about the biological simulation, which still exists to this day through ApeScript, through the interface of the biological simulation through ApeScript, is that the plants and animals are created or maintained in the simulation through very simple principles in quantum mechanics. The idea that the land has various characteristics that can describe where plants and animals would be, basically. That, on a cliff face, you might have one straggle tree kind of growing out, but you certainly wouldn't have a lot of trees on a cliff face. And ideas of land height and water coverage and surface area to sun movement and these kind of things. The sun movement is critical in the migrational movement of animals, in particular in the simulation. What I find fascinating is when I started doing this, it was a relatively radical idea to do a biological simulation based on quantum mechanics, but I found that picked up in the games community, although I'm not referenced with regards to this idea, which seems to be the history of my development and general documentation. So I have heard recently in an interview someone describing how the biological part of their computer game was going to use this amazing method of finding where plants and animals existed based on location, area, height, these kind of characteristics, and I thought, but I mean, the whole nature of the Noble Ape development has been having those kind of experiences pretty well from when I first started putting the documentation online up until the present day. In any case, I digress. What we have currently in the simulation is the only method of accessing the biological simulation is through ApeScript, through the way the apes interact with their environment, primarily in terms of eating more than anything, that the ape wants to instigate how much of a particular food source is in their particular area. However, perhaps it could be used in more detail for apes developing a fascination in various bird life or things like that, the kind of bird watching, noble ape, who knows. But there's nothing in the visualization currently that accesses the biological simulation, and this is really not a challenge, but something that I'm putting out to people that are developing graphics and physics environments, people like Dave Kerr and Digital Space. In fact, there are a lot of graphics physics environment developments going on. And rather than kind of dabble in that, what I've decided to do is just provide an interface to that through ApeScript, or the biological simulation through ApeScript. Obviously, the biological simulation can be hardcode accessed as well, and I don't have any aversion to that either. I'm certainly going to make it available in a DLL, which is the whole Moon Monkeys development, to take another sideline. But I would like to actually increase the biological environment considerably and probably return it back to the original simulation in terms of having 12 simulated animal species and 12 simulated plant species. I got that terribly wrong, didn't I? There are 12 simulated animal species, including noble ape and fierce feline, which means that there are 10 there, and there are 14 plant species. I would also like to return the fierce feline to the noble ape simulation, which is a kind of repopulation, if you want a kind of endangered species analogy, of the fierce feline into the noble ape simulation. I don't have any time frame associated with this, but I think it would be very cool to have a different coloured dot chasing the noble apes through the typical downloaded interface. I think that would be a very cool feature, particularly now death is relatively central in the simulation. And my feeling is that there is probably a third as many fierce felines as there are noble apes, but they should have the same kind of birth and death cycle in some regard. It would be cool actually if they had a similar kind of cognitive simulation as well, maybe a smaller brain. But yeah, this certainly gives a lot of options to think about, and I'll certainly need to consider in the next few months reinstating the fierce felines. I think that would be a very neat feature, and all the code fundamentally in terms of their stalking and turning in particular directions or things of this nature already exists in the noble ape simulation, so that would certainly be something relatively cool to add back into the simulation. In terms of visualization and biology, and I really would like to. I mean, I'm not an artist, and I think the history of the noble ape simulation has shown, the noble ape development in general has shown that I'm not an artist, and my interest is not. Well, I have a really strong interest in art, and I would like to see artists get involved in the noble ape simulation and create artwork for the noble ape simulation. My own personal ability is only so much, and I can only do what exists within my personal ability. I think this is the legacy of the noble ape development in total. So my sense is that really the addition of plants and animals in a visualized setting, what I'm calling the True 3D project, is really something that either I will have to do through mathematics, I'll have to find ways of mathematically emulating the plants and animals, which is doable in some regard in terms of their physical form, or I will require the assistance of artists. And what I've thought of in the past is just putting up money, basically, in order to employ an artist very much part-time for a wide variety of kind of art-related projects to do with Noble Ape. And I think probably something similar to the ApeScript contest could be doable as well, except I think Noble Ape currently has a far greater footing in the the nature of ApeScript contestants as opposed to artists. So it's something that I've really been thinking about quite heavily for the past 4 years at least. I reflect back when I was in the UK about trying to find and approach artists without much success. So my sense is that actually visualizing the plants and animals could go down two possible routes. It may be easier in the medium to long term to actually write mathematical emulators to describe particularly the plants, but also to a lesser extent the animals. And this is certainly something as well that I did, or started to develop, in the early days of the simulation. There were a lot of graphical kind of vector drawings and interpolations of what the noble ape should look like in vector space and how that can change through various parameters, the use of noble ape genetics presently, and the fact that they're so central in the kind of baiting and mutating component of the simulation, or mating in particular. There is no formal mutation. it would be nice to have various factors that could be applied, and this is certainly something that I used in the kind of vision statement with regards to the True 3D Noble Ape simulation, which is a kind of full screen, beautiful polygonal graphics kind of environment, if that isn't an oxymoron, or maybe a tautology. I think probably more likely a tautology. Anyway, so that is the biological simulation component of the Noble Ape simulation as it currently stands. I hope you've enjoyed my musing with regards to this topic, and thank you very much for tuning in, and look forward to you tuning in next time.